Tonight we're looking at Job chapters 29 through 31. And there's a reason for it. This is Job's last defense, if you will. I'm calling it his final defense. And what we find here is Job is actually reaching out to God. He's defending himself before the three men, actually four men. Elihu has not spoken yet. He will speak after this. But these men that have, especially the first three, that have basically berated him instead of comforting him because he will not repent, will not ask God to forgive him for what he's done, and he doesn't know what he's done. He's asking God, please tell me, please show me. And so what we have here in these three chapters, Job is reaching out and he's going back. He's looking at his past, and then he's focusing on his present, and then the last chapter is his appeal to God about what is yet to come. In the past, he's looking at what we're going to call the joys of his past, the way things used to be, the good old days, as we may say. In the second chapter, chapter 30, he's focusing upon where he's at now as a result of what's happened to him by what he considers to be God's judgment. And then in the last chapter, chapter 31, it is an appeal of sorts in which he's asking God, please, have I ever, and he's making his defense, have I ever done this? If I've done this, then may this happen, and this happen to me. If I've done this, then may you punish me in this way. In order to basically assert his righteousness. As we work through this, there's some interesting things for us to note, and we'll work on them. But first of all, the idea of the good old days. The joys of his past. It's not always good. It's good to go back and think about the good old days as long as we don't elevate them beyond where we are today, because sometimes in looking at the good old days or the way things used to be, we forget the reality of the present and where we need to go from here. And so what we find here in Job chapter 29 and in the first few verses of that chapter, Job is remembering something that was important to him, the joys of, and that's what each of these are about. But the first one is the joy of God's presence in his home. He goes back and he remembers what it was like with God as the one who oversaw his home. And if you'll notice here in verses 2 through 6, Job longs for the days past when, as he says in verse 2, God watched over him. And a time when when Job walked by God's light through the darkness. These are things that he remembers that God did for him. There was a time he remembers when the friendship of God was over his tent. And he says, the Almighty was yet with me and my children were around me. He's remembering those days when God was shining over him. He had his children around him. It's only natural. And in those days, he says that his steps were bathed in butter in verse 6, and the rock poured out for him streams of oil. In other words, what Job is saying is, I wish I were back in the prime of my life. When the kids were small and they were running all over the house, when things were good and everything was it was like my life was blessed. A wise man once wrote that if we focus so much on the glories of the past that we ignore the opportunities of the present, we may end up unprepared to meet the future. We focus so much on the past that we ignore the opportunities of the present. We may find ourselves unprepared to meet the future. I don't believe that is Job's case, but I know it can be true of us. We long for the days gone by, and we're not living in the present and not focusing on where we need to go. You see, there is a truth that we must all face in this room. And that is, unless the Lord returns to take us to heaven, we're all going to die. And I'm not trying to be morbid. That's just one of the things when Solomon said it's good to go to the house of the morning, and he talked about the wise being there. It is because we are reminded of the brevity of life and the uncertainty of life. We don't know how long we have, how long we may live. And so one of the things I think we are to take from this is that all of us must be prepared for old age and eventually for death. When we grow up, when we're young, we don't think anything about getting old. But the closer we get to those years, the more it becomes a reality. And I've heard many of you say to me, growing old isn't fun. Even though it's not fun, it is a stage of life that we are to show those younger than us and those who know us how a Christian faces life as he or she ages. The second thing that Job brings out when he talks about the joys of his past, beginning in verse 7, is he remembers a time when he had respect from those around him. There was a time when he enjoyed that. He talked about young men would step aside to let him pass when he walked through the city. He talked about how the old men would stand up whenever he came in and took his seat at the city gates, and how those who heard him speak blessed him. Those who spoke or who saw him spoke well of him. And he remembers this. The voice of the nobles was hushed. The tongue stuck to their palate, as he says. And when the ear heard, it called me blessed. These were the things. He also remembers a time in his life when he was able to minister to others that he encountered. Others in his life, others that he saw in the community. Verses 12 through 17, Job is sharing that God has given him, or what God has given him with those around him. He talks about the poor. He talks about the orphan and the widow and the blind and the lame. Earlier, if we go back to chapter 22, there in verses 5 through 9, Eliphaz, one of his friends, had accused Job of exploiting the poor and the needy. Job had denied it. And Job here goes back in verses 12 through 17 to basically say, I delivered the poor who cried for help, the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. Job was that type of person. And even to the extent, if you'll look at this, not only was he a compassionate man who brought joy to those who were less fortunate, something else he says, he promoted righteousness and justice within his community. He stood for what was right. And anyone that knew Job knew this is the man that is going to stand up for what he knows to be right and true. So not only was he helping the needy, he was at the same time confronting those who were wicked on behalf of those whom they were mistreating. Job was a man that wanted things to be done right. He wanted people to be treated well. He wanted people to be cared for. What does this say to us? You know, when we look at our lives and when we look at how we've lived our lives to the present time, what have we done for those around us? Are others grateful that we've been a part of their lives? Have we made a positive difference in the lives of those that we've encountered? I think all of you in this room understand the type of person I'm talking about. And there may be somebody that in your mind that when those traits are mentioned, that person automatically comes to your mind. I remember this person and how they used to do this and how they were so well respected in this community and how they always cared about others around them and would go out of their way to help those. This was what Job did. But at the same time, he talks about in his past, he remembered a time when he had confidence in the future. There in verses 18 through 20, before his calamity struck, he looked forward to the future. If you'll notice what he says, then I thought I shall die in my rest and multiply my days as the sand, my root is spread out to the waters as dew lies all night on the branch. My glory is ever new with me and my bow is renewed in my hand. Job saw himself living to a ripe old age, continuing to be productive until that time, and then finally dying in peace. I mean, what individual doesn't long for that? I want to live to be a ripe old age, enjoy life, be productive as long as I can, and then when God calls me home, let Him call me home. That's what Job was looking forward to. Didn't work out that way. What's that say to us? We can make all kinds of plans. We can hope that God lets us live to be a ripe old age and that we are still able to go and do and be active in the things that we want to be active in, that our mind is still sharp and our body still lets us do the things that we think and hope we can do. And then finally I love what Eric often prays in his prayers, give us a peaceful time in which to die. And then that's it. But it doesn't happen that way, does it? We all know more than one instance in which it has not turned out that way. Job had that confidence when he was young. And then also, he had the privilege of speaking words of encouragement and help to those around him. He was a man whose counsel was sought. If you'll notice here in verses 21 through 25, the last few verses of this chapter, he says, to me they listened and waited and kept silent for my counsel. After my words they did not speak again, and my speech dropped on them. They waited for me as for the rain, and opened their mouth as for the spring rain. I smiled on them when they did not believe, and the light of my face did not cast down. I chose a way for them and sat as chief, and dwelt as a king among the troops, as one who comforted the mourners. Job was the one that others came to. His words were respected. They were appreciated. He encouraged people by his smile. You might call him the Barnabas of the Old Testament, because that was the nature of Job. And yet, Job was also a man who was wise enough to know that he had to face the reality of what was going on in his life in the present. And not to try to just escape that and bury himself in the memories of the past. It sometimes is easy to do when the present isn't so pleasant, to suddenly bury ourselves in the memories of the past, what life used to be like, how days used to be in days gone by. If you or I refuse to come to grips with life in the present, what we find ourselves in danger of doing is risking our own reality and losing touch with who we really are. So we've always got to stop and say, where am I now? This is what was good in the past. And I'll be honest with you, I look back over my life. My wife and I were talking about it this past week. I have lived a blessed life. I have lived a very blessed life, and I know it. God has been good to me. He's given me a great wife, and we have enjoyed being with a lot of good people over the years. And I just know that it's because of what He's done. But I also know that I can't go back and live in that arena of my life. I'm like everyone else. I have to keep moving forward. And if we talk about what we did yesterday, then most likely we're not doing anything today. So we've got to keep moving forward. And what Job now does, if you look at chapter 30, is he comes back and he looks at where he's at in his present because of what's happening to him, and he believes it's God's judgment. But he says, here's where I'm at now. I have no respect. I'm not comparing him to Rodney Dangerfield. I have no respect at all. But basically, that's what Job is saying. I have no respect. The young men who used to step aside when Job came through, they don't do that anymore. If anything, they mock him. In the past, they respected him. But they respected him, as he's now seeing, not because of his character or because of his integrity, but because they hope to benefit from his position and from his wealth. He can do something for us. And not only that, their respect that they did give to him was a hypocritical respect. According to what Job says, if you look down in verse 9, he says, I have now become their taunt. I have even become a byword to them. And if you notice verse 10, he says, they abhor me and stand aloof from me, and they do not refrain from spitting at my face. That's what he said. These young men who used to stand out of the way when I came through, who used to show me respect, I know now it wasn't because of they truly respected me. I know it was just they wanted something, and now they have no problems with spitting at me. I'm a taunt. I'm a byword. And not only that, now because of his weak and emaciated condition, what Job finds is that they attack him and they make it impossible for him to really do anything. Verse 13, he says, they break up my path, they profit from my destruction, and no one restrains them. And so where is Job? He's at a point in his life now where he no longer feels respected and he no longer feels safe. That's where he finds himself. Not only that, he says, not only does he say, I have no respect, he says, I have no rest. And the fact that he has no rest is because of the pain and everything he's going through in his life. He says, days of affliction, verse 16, have seized me. The nights, or he does not look forward to the nights because they're just unending pain, as he brings out in verse 17. At night it pierces my bones within me, and my gnawing pains take no rest. Have you ever known anybody that just could not get rest when they lay down to sleep? Maybe you're a person who struggles with that yourself. And they just cannot. It's painful for them. They can't find a position in which they can lay where they can actually get some rest. This is where Job's at because of what's going on in his life. And in verses 18 and 19, he says, it's as if God had just grabbed him by the clothes and then just slung him down in the mire or the mud. And even though he stands up and cries out to God, verse 20, I cry out to you for help, but you do not answer me. I stand up, you turn your attention against me. You have become cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride, and you dissolve me in the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death, to the house of the meeting for all the living. Death to Job seemed inevitable. He doesn't see himself progressing out of his present circumstance. And so he says, I have no respect, I have no rest. And then in verses 24 and 25, he says, I have no help. He says, yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand, or in his disaster therefore cry out for help? Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? In other words, when someone else is struggling, when someone else's life is hard, did I not weep for them? Did I not reach out to them? Did I not try to help them? And then he says, when I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. You know, I'm in that circumstance. I want help, but it's not coming. Instead, I get darkness. Instead, I get evil, and I'm seething within, and I cannot relax, and days of affliction just confront me. I go about mourning without comfort. I stand up in the assembly and I cry out for help. All of these things, he says he's doing. Why do we help others? Why do you and I do good for someone else? Is it because we want to obligate them to helping us at some point in our lives? No. We shouldn't help others for that reason. We should help others because that's who we are. That's what we do as God's people. And that's what Jesus spoke about in his Sermon on the Mount. Let your light so shine before men, or shine before men in such a way that they may do what? See your good works and glorify God. We are God's servants, and God has placed us here to do good. Jesus, if you remember, this is what Peter said to Cornelius. He went about doing good, and if we are going to imitate him, then we should be people who go about doing good. And yet, what we find Job saying is, I have no help. I've reached out to others, I've cared for others, I've tried to do for others, but when I need it myself, it doesn't come to me. And if anything, what happens is I find myself as a person, this is his next one, with no future. As we noticed in the last chapter, during the days of Job's prosperity, he had expected to live a long, comfortable life and die peaceably. He had expected good, but instead evil came. He had waited for light, but instead, as we saw, he received darkness. And as a result, he finds himself seething within, cannot relax. Days of affliction confront him. I don't have a future. And I have no ministry. Remember before, he would reach out and he would care for the poor and the needy and the orphan, and he would be an encouragement, and others were encouraged by his words, and his smile would bring comfort to others around him. Now, he can't do that anymore. If anything, what has changed, if you'll notice, he says in verse 29, I become a brother to jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black on me and my bones burn with fever. How do you comfort someone when you have nothing to offer them? He says at the very last verse, therefore my harp is turned to mourning and my flute to the sound of those who weep. Where before his voice was a voice that was pleasant, it was a voice that encouraged, it was a voice that uplifted. He said, now it's not that. It's mourning and weeping and pain and anguish. Have you ever been around someone that all they seem to talk about, all you hear is, oh, woe is me, oh, woe is me, oh, woe is me. And it reaches a point where you think, I don't know how much I can stay and help this person because they're starting to pull me down as well. And you do what you can, but after a while, you need somebody to help you minister to that person because it's wearing you out. And Job is one of those people right now where he has no encouragement for others. He has no word of advice. He has no wisdom that he's going to share. All he's got is these are words of woe and anguish and pain, and he doesn't know who's going to help him. And so he says, I have the music, any music is just a funeral dirge. So what is it that he wants? It's what we find in chapter 31. He wants vindication. He wants God to finally say, Job, you're not guilty. You haven't done those things that they're accusing you of. You're an innocent man. And so what he does is he speaks about this desire, and in the first 12 verses of chapter 31, what Job does is he presents to us 3 specific sins that can trap or trip up any man. The first of those 3 is lust. If you'll notice verses 1 through 4, he says, I've made a covenant with my eyes, how then could I gaze at a virgin? And what is the portion of God from above, or the heritage of the Almighty from on high? Is it not calamity to the unjust and disaster to those who work iniquity? Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? Job has said, I guard my eyes. I've made a covenant that I will not, as he says, gaze at a virgin. Jesus said, if you will remember, everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You see, that this lust is the first step toward that sin of adultery. And sin in the heart is the first step in that act. And we never know where our imagination is going to take us. So men, what Job is saying is, I've made a covenant. I will not. I will avert my eyes. I will do something else. I will leave the room if I have to, but I will not. I will not take something in that I know will lead me down a wrong path. God knows our thoughts. He knows the intents of our hearts. And one of these days, He will judge us for both. So we've got to be careful to guard our hearts. The second thing that he brings out is deceit. He's gone from lust to deceit. Verses 5 through 8, if you'll notice what he says here, he says, if I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened after deceit, let him weigh me with accurate scales. Let God know my integrity. If my step has turned from the way or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands, let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. What Job is saying is, I've never, in all my years, and in all the businesses I've run, and running everything that I have or had, I've never been known for any deceitful practice. I've used honest scales, honest weights. I have been above board in my business dealings. I did not deceive somebody in order to make more money to put into my pocket. I did not do that. And if I am guilty of these things, if God finds that I'm guilty of these things, then I want Him to take my next year's crop and just let it go to someone else. I don't want it if I'm guilty of that. The third thing that he brings out, he's had lust, deceit, and now he comes to adultery. And in verse 9, here's what he says. He says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, if I've lurked at my neighbor's doorway, may my wife grind for another and let others kneel down over her, for that would be a lustful crime. Moreover, it would be an iniquity punishable by the judges, for it would be fire that consumes to abandon and would uproot all my increase. Adultery begins in the heart. And Job has stated that he had never lurked at his neighbor's wife. And if he had, he says, let God take my wife and make her a slave for somebody else and let her be that person's concubine. Job says, I'm innocent of these things. Things that typically trip men up, he says, I'm innocent of those things. But then he also looks at himself as an employer. If you'll notice in verses 13 through 15, he says, if I've despised the claim of my male or female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises and when He calls me to account? And what will I answer Him? You hear what Job is saying? First of all, Job is generous to his servants. He's tried to settle any grievance they had against him fairly. And he knows one day he's going to have to give an account to God. You know, if I haven't dealt fairly with them, I'm going to have to give an account to God because I haven't dealt fairly with them. And I want you to notice something else he brings out. In verse 15, he says, did he or did not he who made me in the womb make him, and the same one fashions us in the womb? In other words, did not God who made my servants also make me? Did God not fashion both of us in the womb? I'm no better than they are. Would that we looked at one another that way. Would that we realize that every single one of us are created by the same God in someone's womb, and God looks at us as equals. Oh, there may be some in this room that are worth more financially than others. There are some I know that don't have as much as others may have. Some may have a higher position in life than others may have. But folks, when it's all said and done, when we stand before God, all of that does not matter. What God is going to look at is what we have done with the life He's given us and how we've treated those around us and how we have responded to the blessings that He gives us. And Job says, I've tried to be a good employer, and I've done what I believe is right. Not only has he been a good employer, he argues, I've been a good neighbor. If you'll notice there in verse 16, he says, if I've kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten any morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it, but from my youth he grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder, I love this, let my shoulder fall from its socket and my arm be broken off at the elbow. For calamity is from God. Or calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of His majesty I can do nothing. He said, if I haven't treated my neighbor in a good and just and right way, then may God punish me if I've mistreated anyone who was poor, who was a widow, who was an orphan, who was in need. But he takes it a step beyond that. Not just his neighbor. if you look down at verses 29 and 30, he also talks to us about how he treated his enemies. And here's what he said. Have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy or exulted when evil befell him? No. I've not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for his life in a curse. Have the men of my tent not said, who can find one who has not been satisfied with his meat? The alien has not lodged outside, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. He has done everything he could to take care of those who were not only his enemies, to treat them right, but even the stranger passing through town. He says, I've opened my doors to the traveler. He's taken care of those around him. And none of his servants could ever accuse him of being selfish. And then, in his response to God, if you look back at verses 24 through 28, he says this. He says, if I put my confidence in gold and called fine gold my trust, if I've gloated because of my wealth was great and because my hand had secured so much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone or the moon going in splendor and my heart became secretly enticed and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, that too would have been an iniquity calling for judgment, for I would have denied God above. If gold and his wealth and the things he had acquired meant more to him than God, he knew he was wrong. Earlier, Eliphaz had accused him, back in chapter 22, verses 24 and 25, he had accused him of making gold his God. Job said, I didn't do that. And he knew that even though others may not see him worshiping his gold or worshiping the heavens, because that's what some people did, worship the moon, worship the sun, worship the stars. He knew God would see that if he did it, and God would judge him as being unfaithful. But the last thing that he brings out right here at the end has to do with his stewardship. Stewardship of the land. He says, if the land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I've eaten its fruit without money or have caused its owners to lose their lives, let briars grow instead of wheat and stinkweed instead of barley. Job knew he was a steward of everything God had given him, and that included the land that he took care of, that he farmed, that he grew his wheat and he grew his barley on. And he asked God, if I've abused the land, or if I've overworked or underpaid my field hands, then instead of barley and wheat for my harvest, give me weeds, because I don't deserve any more. Job has maintained his integrity all the way to this point. I have been a man who's worked to honor you, to treat my fellow man the way you would have me to treat them, to treat my servants the way you would have me to treat them, to treat the strangers, everyone that I encounter, the way I should. And so what Job is saying is, vindicate me. Just tell me that I'm not guilty before you. His three friends believed God would condemn him. If you read the book, you know differently. You know God does not condemn him. You know the outcome. But what does this have to do with us tonight? A lot. Because there's one question that each one of us must answer for ourselves. No one else in this room can answer it for you. And the question is this: how have I lived my life before God? How have I lived my life before God? Because God sees how we treat everyone. He sees what we do with our money. He sees what's important to us. He sees where our priorities are. He sees how we treat our friends. He sees how we treat our neighbors. He sees how we treat the people that work for us. He sees how we treat our enemies. There is nothing that is hidden from His sight. He sees everything in our lives that no one else in this room may know about us, but God does. And the question that each one of us must come to terms with is, when God examines me, when God looks at me, what does God see? Because it doesn't matter what I've hidden from anyone else. What matters is what I've not been able to hide from God and never would hide from God and shouldn't want to hide from God. If God were to examine our lives in the same way that Job asked God to examine his life, how would we come out? What would he say? If we know in our heart of hearts that we've got sin that we haven't addressed, that God one day will, it's better to ask him to forgive it now and to work to get our lives back on track. If we're Christians, if we're striving to walk in those paths of righteousness that our Lord seeks to lead us in, it may be that we need at times to stop and say, you know my life, you know my heart. You know the secrets that no one else knows. Please forgive. Please help me to walk the path you call me to walk. And if you're here tonight, and as you look at your own life, you know, I'm not a Christian. I've been coming. I've listened. I like your lessons and the lessons of those that teach and preach, but I've not yet done anything about it. I'm asking you, please, don't leave. If we need to talk with you, we will. If we need to study with you, we will. I don't care how late it goes, but if you need to obey the gospel, if you need to come to Christ in obedient faith and let him wash away your sins, why not tonight? If you need to respond to his invitation, won't you come as together we stand and sing?